The auctioneer called her too tall, too plain, and too old to marry, and the men along the stockyard rail laughed and turned their backs on her like she was a lame horse they would not feed through winter. Then a dust-caked stranger who had walked into Calder Springs an hour before set 2 worn dollars down on the splintered rail and said plain as noon that he would take the girl off their hands and they could keep their pity. He did not say it loud. He said it the way a man says a thing he has already decided, and the laughing along the rail dried up in the dust. Tamsin Boone stood very straight on the low wooden platform where they had put her, a tall girl in a faded, dusty rose calico dress and a thin gray shawl, her honey-blonde hair pinned up with loose strands fallen at her temple, her chin lifted higher than her courage. She was 19, and she had no people left. Her father had died of the lung fever that spring owing everyone in town, and when the debts were counted, there had been nothing left but a girl too big and too quiet for anyone to want. The town council, in its Christian charity, had decided the cleanest answer was to bind her out to whoever would pay her father's smallest debt and feed her. $2. That was the figure they had settled on, $2 to be rid of her, and not a man at the rail had reached for his pocket until the stranger did. His name was Wade Garrett, though no one in Calder Springs knew it yet. He was 32 and looked older around the eyes, 6'1", lean and weathered, with several days of dark stubble and a faint old scar riding along his jaw, and he wore a sweat-stained brown felt hat, low, and a worn tan canvas jacket gone pale at the seams. He had a single saddlebag and a tired buckskin mare tied at the trough, and in the breast pocket of his shirt he carried a brass pocket watch that did not keep good time anymore. He had not come to Calder Springs for a wife. He had come for feed and a night's rest and the road out the far side. But he had stood at the back of the small, ugly crowd and watched them put a price on a girl who would not let herself cry in front of them, and something old and broken in him had stood up before his good sense could stop it. The auctioneer, a soft, fat man named Pruitt who clerked at the bank, blinked at the $2 and then at Garrett. "You'll be wanting the paper drawn then," he said, already smelling a small commission. "Bind her proper. Cook, wash, keep house. A man your age alone on a claim could use—" "I don't want a wife," Garrett said. The words landed flat and clear in the hot stillness. "I'll pay her father's debt, and she's free. She comes if she wants to. She goes if she wants to. You write that on your paper, or I take my $2 back and ride out, and you can explain to your counsel why the girl's still standing on your block at supper." For a moment, nobody on the rail moved. A heavy-set rancher named Holloway, who had laughed loudest, spat into the dust and muttered that the drifter was a fool, that the tall girl would eat him out of house and home and run off with the first man who'd have her. Garrett did not look at him. He looked at Tamsin, and he took off his hat, which no man had done for her all that long morning, and he held it against his chest. "Miss," he said quietly, "I've got a poor little place 2 days north with a sound roof and a cold spring and not much else. I won't trouble you. You'd have the house. I'd take the barn. It's a hard offer, and not much of one, but it's freely made and it's yours to refuse." She looked at him a long time. The crowd waited for her to weep or to spit in his face, and she did neither. She climbed down off the platform on her own, smoothed her dusty skirt, and said, "I can cook and keep a garden, and I am not afraid of work. I will not be afraid of you either, until you give me a reason." And she walked to the buckskin mare and waited beside it, straight-backed, while the dust settled and the men at the rail found suddenly that they had nothing to say. If you've ever watched the whole world decide a good person was worth nothing, and quietly hoped, with everything in you, that just one decent soul would see them true, then you already belong here at Sunlit Frontier Tales, and you ought to take a moment and subscribe, because every story I tell is exactly this. The tall girl nobody wanted, the drifter everybody feared, the overlooked one who turns out to be the only one worth choosing. Stay with me, because $2 bought Wade Garrett far more than a debt that morning, and what it bought him is the part I have been waiting to tell you. They rode north out of Calder Springs in the long gold light of afternoon, and for the first hour, neither one of them said a single word. Tamsin sat the mare's rump with her hands knotted in her shawl, watching the town shrink behind them, watching the only place she had ever lived fall away into grass. Garrett walked and led the mare to spare it her weight on the climb, and once, when the trail turned rocky, he pulled the brass watch from his pocket and looked at it, not for the time, and put it back. She saw him do it. She did not ask. People who have lost everything learn quick to recognize that look on somebody else. She had braced herself, somewhere on the platform that morning, for the offer to be a lie. She had heard the stories the other girls whispered, of men who spoke soft in the open and turned to something else once the town was out of sight, and she had told herself she would watch this stranger close and trust nothing until he had earned it. So she watched him. She watched the easy, patient way he handled the mare, never hauling on its mouth, talking to it low when the footing went bad. She watched him stop without being asked when a thorn worked into the animal's frog, and kneel in the dirt in the heat and dig it out gentle with his knife while the mare leaned its big head trustingly against his shoulder. A horse will tell you about a man faster than the man ever will, her father used to say, back before the fever took the sense and then the breath out of him, and the mare had already made up its mind. By the time the first stars came out, she had not relaxed exactly, but the knot in her shawl had loosened a little, and she had stopped rehearsing the words she would scream if he came across the fire at her. They camped that night in the lee of a low ridge, and he built the fire and gave her the bedroll and his coat and took the bare ground himself, the saddle for a pillow, the watch resting open on his chest where the firelight could find the dull brass of it. She lay awake a long time on the far side of the fire, watching him through the flames, waiting the way a beaten dog waits for the boot. And the boot never came. He only fed the fire once in the small hours, settled his hat back over his eyes, and slept. In the morning, she found he had walked 2 miles before dawn to fill the canteens from a seep so she would have clean water to wash, and she stood looking at the full canteens for a while before she made the coffee. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing nobody had done for her since her mother died. The second day, the country opened up and turned hard. Around noon, the trail dropped to a river running fast and cold off the high country, swollen and brown with the spring melt, the regular ford gone deep and ugly under it, and Garrett stood on the bank a long while reading the water before he said anything. "There's a shelf of good rock about 40 foot up," he said at last. "We'll cross there, slow, and I'll walk on the downstream side. If the mare stumbles, you turn loose of her and you grab for me, you understand? Don't you fight the water, and don't you reach for your bundle. A wet bundle dries. You don't." He looked up at her then, plain and steady. "I have not brought you 2 days out of that town to lose you in a creek, so you do exactly what I say, and we will both be drinking coffee on the far bank inside the hour." And Tamsin, who had spent 19 years being told she was too big to be careful with, found that being spoken to like a thing somebody intended to keep undid her more than any cruelty ever had. They crossed slow. The water came up cold and hard to the mare's belly and pushed, and once a hidden stone rolled under its hoof, and the animal lurched, and Tamsin's heart went straight up into her throat. But Garrett's hand was already there, flat and firm against the mare's shoulder, steadying, his voice low and unhurried over the roar of it, and they came up, dripping and whole on the rock shelf of the far side just as he had said. She sat the streaming mare and shook, and he looked up at her white face and did the strangest thing. He smiled, just a little, the first she had seen on him, tired and crooked and kind. "You did fine," he said. "Better than fine." And he built a fire on the bank and dried her shawl over it before they rode on, and she decided, watching the steam rise off the wool, that whatever else this stranger was, he was not a liar. The place, when they reached it on the second evening, was poorer than he had promised and better than she had feared. A low log house with a sound shingle roof and a stone chimney, a lean-to barn, a cold spring running clear from a cleft in the rock, a quarter section of grass going to seed, and a single dun horse and a milk cow that came up lowing at the sight of him. He carried her small bundle to the door of the house and set it on the step, and did not go in. "It's yours," he said. "I'll be in the barn if you need a thing. I'll teach you the well rope and the cow in the morning. Sleep easy." And he tipped his hat and walked to the barn, and Tamsin stood in the doorway of the first thing that had ever been her own and breathed, and the breath shook. That first night she did not sleep so much as keep a kind of wondering watch over her own good fortune, getting up twice to stand in the door and look at the dark shape of the barn and make sure it was real. The house was poor and bare, a rope bed, a table, a single shelf, a hearth swept clean, but it was sound, and it was quiet, and it was hers, and no one in it was going to wake her with a debt or a sneer or a hand. She found a stub of candle, and by its light she went over the little house inch by inch, slow and disbelieving, like a person handling a thing they cannot quite credit belongs to them. And in a tin on the shelf she found a few dried beans and a twist of coffee, and tucked behind it, where a man would put a thing he did not want to look at, a child's small carved wooden horse, the paint worn off its mane by some other hand long ago. She held it a moment in the candlelight and understood she had walked into the middle of somebody else's grief, and she set it back exactly as she had found it, and she said nothing about it for a long time. He kept his word. That was the thing about Wade Garrett that she came to understand over the slow gold weeks of that summer. He kept every word, and he asked for nothing back. He fixed the sagging garden fence and turned the soil for her, and never once stepped into the house uninvited. He showed her how to draw the well rope without skinning her hands, and how to gentle the cow, and how to read the sky for weather. He spoke little, but when he spoke it was kind, and it was true, and the dangerous, frightening stranger the town had warned her about turned out to be the safest man she had ever stood beside. The work made her strong, and the quiet made her well. She planted the garden, and it came up green. She mended his torn coat without being asked and left it folded on the rail of the corral, and he found it there and held it a long moment before he put it on. There was a rhythm to those days that healed her without her noticing it happening. She woke before him most mornings and had the fire going and the coffee on by the time he came up from the barn, and he would stand in the door with his hat in his hand and say, "Good morning, miss," the same 2 words every day, like a small steady tithe of respect he paid her at dawn. They worked the long bright hours apart and together, she in the garden and the house, he with the stock and the fences and the hay. And they took the noon meal in the shade of the house and the supper at the table, and slowly, without either of them deciding it, the silences between them stopped being the silences of strangers, and became the easy quiet of two people who no longer needed to fill the air to feel safe in it. He found out she could read, and that she had a quick, clean mind under all that the town had buried, and he started bringing her the only two books he owned, a worn Bible and a battered almanac, and listening, with something like hunger, while she read aloud by the fire at night. He never told her he could not read those words himself. She worked it out as she worked most things out, by watching, and she said nothing, and she only began, here and there, to spell a word out slow as she read it, her finger under it, as if to herself, so that a man listening close could learn his letters and never have to admit he was learning them. They were not entirely alone up there in the grass. 2 ridges over lived an old widow named Della Pruitt, no kin to the bank clerk, a small bent woman with a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing, who came rattling up the trail in a mule cart in the 3rd week with a covered crock of beans and a question. "You the tall girl from Calder Springs they all got their tongues wagging over?" she said, not unkind, and when Tamsin lifted her chin and said she was, Della nodded as if a thing had been settled. "Good. Town's a pack of fools and always has been. Heat's coming hard this year. You'll want to mound dirt up the north side of that garden before August or the wind takes your beans." Then she looked the place over, looked at Garrett mending the barn door with his hat pushed back, looked at the careful daylight he kept between himself and the girl, and something softened in the old woman's hard face. She came back the next week. She came back the week after that. She taught Tamsin to put up the beans and to render lard and to dose the cow when its eye went runny, and she never once asked the question the rest of the county was asking, which was whether the drifter and the tall girl shared a roof, because Della Pruitt had buried 2 husbands and a son, and she knew the difference between gossip and a family being slowly, quietly built. It was Della who carried Tamsin, in the end, back into the regard of the very county that had thrown her away, though neither woman planned it so. Midway through that summer, the Hadley place on the river road was struck down all at once. The whole family abed with a low fever, and the husband too weak to ride for help, and the nearest doctor 2 days off and drunk besides. It was Della who heard of it first, and Della who came rattling up Garrett's trail at first light with her mouth set, and it was Tamsin who climbed into the mule cart beside her without being asked twice, because a girl who has nursed a dying father through a long spring knows things about a sick room that a healthy person never learns. For 9 days, the tall girl all but lived at the Hadley place. She broke the fever in the children with cool cloths and willow tea and a patience that did not run out at 2 in the morning. She washed the bedding and cooked the broth and sat up the long nights so the worn-out mother could sleep, and she did it without one word of payment or thanks asked or expected, because nobody had asked or expected when it was her own. When the Hadleys came back to themselves, the woman wept and held Tamsin's 2 strong hands and called her an angel sent, and word of it traveled the river road the way good word travels, slower than gossip but heavier, and the men who had laughed at the rail in the spring found, by the high heat of August, that their wives had quietly stopped laughing, and had started saying instead that the tall girl up north was the best hand with a sick bed in 3 counties. And a shame, a downright shame, the way the town had used her. Tamsin never went back to Calder Springs to hear them say it. She did not need to. She had stopped, somewhere in those 9 days, needing the town's verdict on her worth at all, and that, more than any apology the town would never quite manage, was the thing that finally set her free of it. But there was a grief in him she could not reach, and it lived inside that brass watch. He carried it everywhere and never wound it, and sometimes in the evening she would see him sitting on a stump at the edge of the firelight with the lid open, looking at something inside it, his weathered face gone somewhere far away. She did not pry. She had her own ghosts, but one warm night near the middle of that summer, when the supper had been good and the talk had come easier than usual, she nodded at his hand and said gently, "Who was she?" Garrett was quiet so long she thought he would not answer. Then he turned the watch over in his fingers and opened the lid, and held it out across the fire so she could see the faded little photograph tucked inside the case. A young woman with a kind, plain face, and beside her, smaller, a little girl of perhaps 4, all eyes and ringlets. "My wife," he said, "Ellen, and our girl. Her name was Sarah." His voice did not break, but it went very level, the way a man's voice goes when breaking is the only other choice. "I had a place down in the Nations. Good place. I went off on a cattle drive this spring. Sarah turned 4, gone 2 months, and there was a sickness came through while I was on the trail. Diphtheria. By the time I rode in, they were 3 weeks in the ground and the neighbors had buried them kind, and there was nothing left for me to do but read the dates off 2 new stones." He closed the watch. "This stopped the day I came home. I never wound it again. Felt wrong to let it go on ticking when theirs had stopped." He looked up at her across the low flames. "I've been riding ever since. Couldn't stay anywhere. Couldn't bear a roof. Then I walked into that stockyard and saw them put a price on you, standing up there too proud to cry, and I thought I was 2 months too late to save my own. I was not going to be too late again." That was the thing she had not understood until that moment, and once she understood it she could not unsee it. He had not bought her out of charity, and he had not bought her out of want. He had bought her because she was the one rescue God had set in front of a man who had failed at the only one that ever mattered to him. The $2 had never been about her at all, and that was somehow the kindest thing of all, and it broke her open. She came around the fire and she sat down next to him close, the first time either of them had crossed that careful distance, and she did not say a clumsy word about his Ellen or his Sarah. She just put her tall, strong hand over his rough one where it held the dead watch, and the 2 of them sat and watched the fire burn down to coals, and neither of them was alone in quite the way they had been that morning. After that, the careful distance was simply gone. The way frost is gone off the grass by mid-morning and nobody can say the exact minute it went. She started calling him Wade, and he started lingering at the supper table. He moved his bedroll from the barn to the front room at her own asking, and slept where he could hear her breathe through the wall and know she was safe. He taught her to ride proper, astride, and she sat the dun like she had been born to it. They were not married, and they spoke no word of marrying, but they built a thing between them across that long gold summer that had no name and needed none. 2 broken people who had each been written off by everyone else, quietly fitting their broken places together until the gaps did not show at all. She brought out the little carved horse one evening after that, the one she'd found behind the coffee tin her first night and set back and never mentioned, and she put it on the table between them without a word and waited. Garrett looked at it a long moment, and his throat worked, and then he picked it up and turned it over in his big rough fingers and said, "Lo, I made that. One winter, when she was 3. Cut it from a piece of the same oak I built the bed out of." He set it down, gentle, facing her. "I couldn't carry it. Couldn't leave it either. I've moved it from the bottom of one saddlebag to the bottom of another for 5 years and never once let myself look at it." He was quiet a moment. "It's the first time it's stood out in the light since." And Tamsin reached across and stood it upright on the shelf above the hearth where it could be seen, and she said, "Then it can stay out now." And neither of them said anything else, but the small wooden horse stood in the firelight every night after that, and a house that had been hiding its grief in a tin became a house that simply kept it, gently, where the living could see it, which is a different and a better thing. The end of summer brought the hay, and the hay brought the first real test of what the two of them were to each other, because there is no quicker way to learn whether two people are a family than to put up a winter's worth of feed together against a turning sky. For a solid week they worked the grass from gray dawn to last light, Garrett swinging the scythe in long, even strokes and Tamsin coming behind to rake and turn and build the windrows, her hands blistering and then hardening, her tall frame that the town had mocked turning out to be worth two of any short girl in a hay field. They barely spoke, and they did not need to. They moved around each other in the work like two people who had done it for years. And when a black squall came boiling up over the North Hills on the 6th afternoon, with the hay still loose on the ground, they did not argue or panic. They just put their heads down and worked, side by side, faster than either could have worked alone, forking the dry hay up onto the wagon and into the barn loft as the first fat drops came down, and the thunder walked the ridge, until the last forkful was under cover and the rain came down in earnest, and they stood together in the open barn door, soaked and breathing hard and grinning at each other like fools, the whole winter's feed safe and dry behind them and the storm doing its worst out front. Tamsin laughed out loud, the first time he had heard her laugh, and Garrett looked at her standing there tall and wet and lit up with it, and something in his weathered face came the rest of the way home. He did not say what he was thinking, but he reached over, careful as he did everything, and tucked a wet strand of honey-blonde hair back off her face, and she let him, and the rain came down, and neither of them stepped away. Then the autumn came, and with it Holloway, the tall rancher who had laughed loudest at the stockyard, riding up the trail with a paper in his hand and two hard men behind him. He had bought the old note on the dry farm at the edge of Calder Springs, Tamsin's father's farm, for pennies, and he had ridden 2 days north not to collect it, but to crow. He sat his horse in Garrett's yard and looked down at the green garden and the mended fence and the tall girl standing in the door of a house that was hers, and Holloway's face curdled because a thing he had named worthless had gone and become a home, and that is a hard thing for a small man to look at. "Heard the drifters playing house with the giraffe," he said, loud, for his men to laugh at. "Town took a vote, Garrett. Girl was bound out improper. No paper signed, no money witnessed. By rights, she's a ward of the county still, and I'm the county's man up here. I'll be taking her back to be bound out legal, to me. I've a use for a strong back that won't cost me wages." He grinned. "Lessen you want to buy her again. What did she go for last time? $2. Garrett came down off the porch slow. He had the look on him that the men at the rail had seen for one moment back in Calder Springs, and Holloway's grin went a little stiff at the edges. But Tamsin spoke first. She stepped out into the yard, tall and straight in her dusty rose dress, and she said, clear, "There was a paper. Mr. Pruitt at the bank drew it and witnessed it before the whole stockyard. It says my father's debt was paid in full, and that I am a free woman who stays of her own will and goes of her own will. You're welcome to ride 2 days back and read it." She had not known, until she said it, how much she had been listening that morning. But she had heard every word Garrett made them write, and she had carried it. Holloway's men looked at each other. A drawn and witnessed paper was a real thing, even 2 days north, even to hard men. And there was something else working on them, too. Something they had not bargained for when they rode up that trail looking for a cowering girl and a soft drifter to push around. They had found instead a tall woman standing square in her own doorway, reciting law at them without a tremor in her voice, and a quiet man at the foot of the porch with the stillness on him that the hired kind of hard man learns early to read and to fear. One of the two glanced at the mended fence and the heavy green garden and the fat stock in the lot, a place plainly worked by people who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what was theirs, and he eased his horse back a step without being told. Holloway felt it go. He tried bluster and he tried threat, his voice climbing as the ground went out from under it. But a man can only crow so long to a yard that will not flinch, and in the end he wheeled his horse and rode off down the trail, spitting promises that nobody believed, his 2 men falling in behind him already half a length apart, the way men ride when they have privately decided their leader is a fool. The dust closed up behind them, and that was the end of him in this story. Because small men who lose the thing they came to spoil do not get a grand reckoning here. They just ride away, and the people they could not break go on living in the sun. When the hoofbeats had faded, Garrett turned to her, and there was something working in his weathered face. "You knew the paper by heart," he said. "I knew you'd protect me before you knew my name," she said. "I figured the least I could do was learn the words that did it." He looked at her for a long moment in the cooling autumn light, and whatever he had carried alone for 5 years seemed to shift on him and settle into a new and easier place. "When you came down off that platform," he said slow, "you said you'd not be afraid of me until I gave you a reason. I've spent every day since trying to make sure I never did." He turned his hat in his hands. "I don't know the words for the rest of it. I never had much call to learn them. But I'd be obliged if you'd stay on through the winter, and the winter after that. And I reckon every one I've got left, if you're willing." It was the nearest thing to a proposal a man like Wade Garrett had in him, plain and unadorned and meant to the bone, and Tamsin Boone, who had been bought for $2 by a town that wanted rid of her, looked at the man who had spent that coin and understood that she was, for the first time in her life, being asked. She said yes the same way he had asked it, plainly, and then she went in and put the supper on, because some of the largest things that happen between 2 people happen quietly, over the ordinary work of an ordinary evening, and are no smaller for it. That winter was hard and clean and good. The snow came down off the north hills and shut them in together, and the little log house with its sound roof and its stone chimney held the warmth, and the brass watch sat on the mantel above the fire, still stopped, still silent, but no longer hidden in a pocket. They were snug, and they were not lonely, and they were, though neither had said the word out loud, a family. He carved her a set of wooden spoons by lamplight, and she taught him the letters he had never properly learned, tracing them on a slate with her tall, steady hand over his, and the long nights that should have been a hardship were the warmest either of them had known in years. There came an evening, somewhere deep in that winter, when he took the slate from her of his own accord and bent over it under the lamp for the better part of an hour, his big scarred hand moving slow and careful, his tongue between his teeth like a schoolboy's, and when he straightened up at last he turned the slate around and showed her what he had written. It was her name, Tamsin, the whole of it, the letters crooked and proud, the first word he had ever set down in his life, and he had spent it on her name. She looked at it for a long time and could not get a single word out, and Garrett, mistaking her silence, started to apologize for the poorness of the letters. And she crossed the little room and stopped his mouth with her hand and shook her head, because there are gifts a person cannot answer in words, and that was one. The neighbors came for the deep of it. The week before Christmas, Della Pruitt's mule went lame, and the old widow turned up in the dusk on foot through the first hard snow, half frozen and entirely unrepentant, declaring she'd be hanged before she'd spend the Lord's birthday 2 ridges from the only folks in the county worth a damn. And so she stayed 3 weeks in the warm front room with the 2 of them, and it was the nearest thing to a proper family Christmas that little house had ever held. They had no money for gifts and wanted for none. Della told the long tangled stories of her 2 dead husbands and her lost boy, told them warm and funny and unafraid, the way only the very old can speak of their dead, and Tamsin understood listening that this was how a person carried a grief out into the light and let it warm the room instead of darken it. And she saw Garrett understand it too, sitting quiet by the fire with the little carved horse on the mantel above him and the brass watch beside it. When a January blizzard pinned them 3 days indoors, Garrett strung a rope from the door to the barn so he could feed the stock without losing himself in the white, and Tamsin stood at the window and watched the rope go taut and slack with him on the end of it, and understood, all at once, that she was no longer afraid of losing anything, because she had finally been given something worth the fear. On the longest night of the year, with the wind walking the eaves and the fire low and red, Tamsin took the dead watch down off the mantel and put it in his hands. "Wade," she said, "I think it's time. I think Ellen and Sarah would want it ticking again. I think they'd want to know you finally stopped riding and came home." And Wade Garrett, who had not wound that watch in 5 long years, sat by the fire with his tall girl beside him, and he turned the little brass key, and the watch came alive in his hands with a small steady tick, and he wept the way a man weeps when grief finally turns the corner into something he can live beside. And it kept time. After that, it always kept time. They were married in the spring by a circuit preacher, with the milk cow and the 2 horses and the green garden for witnesses, and old Della Pruitt stood up beside the bride in her best black dress and cried into a square of linen and pretended she had dust in her eye. No one from Calder Springs was asked, and no one was missed. In time, there were children in that house, 2 of them, a boy and then a girl, and the girl they named Sarah, and Garrett would catch himself watching her chase the chickens across the yard and have to stop a moment and stand very still until the ache turned into something he could carry. He taught the boy to sit a horse, and Tamsin taught them both their letters on the same worn slate, and Della came every Sunday with a crock of beans and a story, and the little log house that had held 2 broken people now held a whole, loud, living family. And every morning before the sun, Wade Garrett would take the brass watch down off the mantel, wind it with the little key, and set it back where his whole family could hear it keeping their time. He had ridden into that dusty town with $2 and a stopped watch, and nothing he could call his own, and he had spent half of it on a tall girl nobody wanted, and in doing it he had bought back the one thing he thought the ground had taken from him for good. Some people are written off because the world is too small and too frightened to see what they are worth, and every so often one quiet soul looks past the laughing and the turned backs and pays the price anyway, and saves 2 lives with the 1 coin. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, so leave a note in the comments and tell me the town you're watching from. And then tell me this: If you'd stood at that rail in the noon sun, would you have laughed with the crowd and turned your back like everyone else? Or would you have set your last $2 on the wood and taken the tall girl home?